Welcome to episode 21 of What Matters Water TV and Podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Wilson, and today we're diving into one of California's most ambitious water projects, the Delta Conveyance Project. Now picture this. The state is facing a future of water instability with more rain, less snow, and more frequent extreme events like drought and flood. Add into the mix the threat of sea level rise, climate change, and earthquakes. Now imagine, if you would, a solution that promises to address these challenges head on. That's where the Delta Conveyance Project comes into play. It is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor designed to improve water reliability for 27 million Californians by modernizing this water transport infrastructure in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. But what does this mean for the environment, local communities, and the future of California's water? To help us navigate these complex waters, we have three distinguished guests. Carrie Buckman, Delta Conveyance Environmental Program Manager from the California Department of Water Resources. She brings a wealth of experience in environmental planning and permitting and will shed light on the state's vision for this project. Graham Bradner, he's Executive Director of the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority. He'll provide insight into the technical challenges and innovations involved in this massive undertaking. And Dr. David Sunding, Emeritus Professor at UC Berkeley, he'll offer a critical analysis of the economic implications. Together, we'll explore the intricacies of Delta Conveyance and its potential impact on California's water future. So sit back, relax, and get ready to dive deep into what really matters in the world of water. Let's get started. Well, welcome to What Matters Water TV and Podcast. Carrie, Graham, and David, thank you so much for being with us. We know it's an important topic that a lot of people in the state are interested in, and I want to jump right straight in. Carrie, you and the state, we've been wrestling and talking about, the way the state manages its water system and the importance that the Sacramento Bay Delta has. Give me a little bit of background about sort of your history with that, sort of where that fits in, and really specifically about sort of what that means then for Delta Conveyance today.
I think that since the State Water Project was developed, there was always a theory that we needed to better be able to convey water through the Delta. The Bay Delta is an incredibly sensitive environment. We need to be able to have a reliable, safe way to move water through that area. And I think that over time, we've been able to look at much less impactful ways of doing that. So starting back in the 80s, from the peripheral canal to water fix, we made the really important change to move the facility underground to really reduce effects and make it smaller. And then again with Delta Conveyance, we've taken a really important step of moving it out of the center of the Delta, as well as really focusing on trying to avoid effects to local communities in the environment.
So, well, Graham, that kind of then sort of brings me to you, right? You're the guy that's sort of been handed sort of the project, right, with the Delta Conveyance as the manager of that process. Tell me about sort of that iteration and sort of what it is that you do through the authority.
Sure. So the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority, we would be and will be the agency responsible for delivering the project. So we would handle all the design contracting as well as construction contracts and restoration activities. For now, our main role is supporting DWR through the environmental permitting and planning process. We provide all the engineering support. So as you were talking about, and Carrie was reflecting on the evolution of the project over time, we've been a key part in terms of performing the siting studies, helping to identify where we could place the major infrastructure, how best to minimize the impacts associated with construction and operation of those facilities. So those processes have led us to where we are today. We've got a project that has a very different alignment. It's a single tunnel, and I think we're in a good position with a project that I think really fits the needs for the state.
Well, and you have most recently, I think, one of the nuances of sort of this iteration, and Carrie, you described it, right? We've been at this for a long time, right? This is kind of like one of those big vexing problems or issues around the state of should we or shouldn't we, how do we? We're really kind of focusing in on how to, as I understand it. But then Dr. Sunding, you then were asked, I think for the first time, really, what is the economic value. We sort of get into this policy of yes, no, maybe, how to, and there's lots of nuances, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is really the first time I've seen that somebody has done or tried to do some type of an economic analysis. And so for every dollar that goes into a project like this, whether or not there's a return on that investment, what is it that your study has shown?
Right. So what we've been doing for the last year and a half is taking a look at what you might think of as the business case for the DCP. On the one hand, we use information from Graham and his group about what the various costs of the project are, construction costs, and then operations and maintenance costs once it begins operating. On the other side of the ledger, we look at the various benefits of the project. And this is where things get complicated, but there are a lot of different types of benefits that we and others see coming from the DCP. Probably the biggest category, the one that we certainly spend a lot of time analyzing, is the benefits to urban water agencies. And the incremental water supplies that are protected by the DCP, essentially they allow urban agencies like those in Southern California to put more water into storage, regardless of when the incremental supplies occur. And then that allows them to enter into drought periods with more water in reserve. That in turn results in fewer and smaller shortages for business and residential customers. And that all has tremendous value. In addition to the water supply benefits of the DCP, we also look at the ability of the project to improve the quality of state water project deliveries, and importantly, to be more resilient following a large earthquake in or near the Delta. The configuration of the DCP allows for the state water project to get up and running quicker or not suffer any kind of a disruption at all. And that also has economic benefit.
So Carrie, I'm going to come back to you for a second, because again, we sort of frame this thing that's been talked about in different iterations for a long time. And I'm always amazed. And I know when we went through this a few years ago, I would do public polling and I'd do some focus groups, and I was always get a bit of a giggle, and then I'd sort of be very sad about it. I would say, okay, do you know where your water comes from? And I'd inevitably, literally had somebody point to their kitchen faucet. And then when I would then follow up with the question of, okay, and tell me a little bit, I mean, what do you know about the Delta? And they said, oh yeah, my Delta faucet, where my water comes from. So the linkage for some doesn't really seem to be there on what the importance is of this facility and what it means really to the entirety of the state, not just any one particular region, one particular industry. Describe for me a little bit about, I mean, Dr. Sunding kind of described supply reliability. I'm thinking just sheer volume of water and how that was structured, literally a generation ago. And what does that then mean as we then talk about, those who may point fingers at others with that sort of circle of, hey, I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that. But how you replace or how you really modernize this kind of facility, that's really becomes part of the equation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think in order to really talk about the importance of the Delta Conveyance Project, we sort of have to take a step back and think about the State Water Project as a whole. So the State Water Project is a system of reservoirs and conveyance facilities that delivers water to Northern California, the Central Coast, the Bay Area, the Central Valley, and Southern California. So it really has a pretty extensive reach. It serves about 27 million Californians clean, safe drinking water, and about 750,000 acres of agricultural land receive water from it. Actually, Dr. Sunding did a study recently that if it was its own nation, it would be the 8th largest economy in the world. So it really is an incredibly important resource for the state of California and the world beyond that. And so really having that project be able to continue in the face of climate change is critically important for California. With climate change, we know that we're going to have changes in our precipitation and hydrologic patterns that are going to change the way the State Water Project functions. So we're expecting to have more rain instead of snow, flashier storm events, and more extreme precipitation swings from drought to flood. And when you start to factor those into how the State Water Project works, and the State Water Project is built on the historic hydrologic pattern that isn't going to be there anymore. But when you factor in those changes, we really see decline. So between now and about 2070, I think we lose about 22% of the water supply from the State Water Project because of climate change. And that's water that's relied on by all of those areas. And not only that, many of those areas sort of use and reuse that water. It's the foundation for groundwater recharge projects, for water recycling. And so we lose it on multiple fronts, I guess.
Well, I come out of that, I spent way too many years in the power sector. It's what you're describing as I used to refer to as base load, right? You have to have that base to be able to do other things. And
Yes.
I know that when we did some analysis some years ago, again, it's that volume of water that comes from the state project. It's one thing to talk about percentages, but I think somebody pointed out to me at one point to replace the volume, and then they'd go point to the ocean as an example, say, hey, just go do some ocean desal. You were going to have to do something like an ocean desal project the size of Carlsbad, like every 6 miles or some crazy number from like Ventura to the Mexican border. And that to me sort of put the volume into perspective. That's, because you're talking, at least from a Southern California perspective, that's 30% of what we use.
Yeah.
That's what, for me, that's sort of seemed what created the opportunity for recycling and stormwater capture and, groundwater storage. But if you didn't have the base, you really got a closed loop system of what is an arid desert region, isn't it, Dr. Sunding?
Yeah, you're exactly right. If you look at Southern California as a whole, about half the water used in Southern California comes from local sources, groundwater primarily, but some others as well. About a quarter historically has come from the Colorado River. That's declining, certainly. And about a quarter has come from the Delta. So just to put things in perspective. And Carrie's right. The area that's served by the State Water Project, not only is the State Water Project big, but the economy it services is big. It's about $2.3 trillion in annual income is produced just within the State Water Project service territory. And that's dependent on the importation of surface water to keep that going, just given the climate in California.
I guess then the question I obviously, I get in this debate, because people get pretty heated about this pretty quickly. And I know once certain messages and narratives are in place, that's really hard to shift them, as we've done in other sources of water. So Karen, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, how do you go about, and I've heard Director Namath, sort of say these things. We didn't really have, it's not a supply issue, it's a management issue. And I guess, how much of it is management of the system if you have, the climate change and the opportunities with the facility? Does that change your management structure? And then I'm going to Graham and sort of talk about, okay, so how do you see, the ultimate design and the construction of this? How does it modify then the ability to manage water, again, for the larger state as opposed to maybe smaller regional constituencies?
I do think that the reason that we're looking at the Delta Conveyance Project is the need to be able to manage the water in a different hydrologic regime. So to be able to capture those high flows when they're available and move them and store them, understanding that they're just not going to be available all the time. It's not going to be a steady flow. We're not going to have snow melt to supply that over a longer period of time. So we have to be able to capture them when they're available. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention is the seismic resilience. We also are really concerned about the risk that if there is a delta levee failure or multiple delta levee failures, the salinity intrusion that would result from that could take the delta supply facilities offline for almost a year, and the water supply or water quality impacts would reduce supplies for probably about another year. So there really are these significant problems associated with management from a variety of perspectives, both climate change, sea level rise, and the seismic risk associated with the Delta.
Well, so Graham, as we've talked about, right, the Bay Delta sort of has developed over 150 years in a way that if you were to design something brand new today, you'd probably do something a little bit different. And so you've got a lot of embedded uses. You've got a lot of conditions, either, man-made or naturally made, things you can't control at this point. How does one go about trying to design a new facility that really does this modernization that we talk about, that sort of solves as many of the issues as possible, knowing that you still have some folks that, they have concerns, right? So how do you go about designing something like this that allows, the greater whole to benefit and then prove the concept for those that may still be skeptical?
Right. Well, I guess I sort of tackle it in a couple of different concepts, at least in my head. So first, Carrie's laying out the nature of the existing system, some of the constraints with the existing system. The infrastructure in place now is positioned down in the South Delta. It's at the end, sort of some terminal sloughs. It's got Clifton Court Forebay, which is how the water tees up and is lifted into Bethany Reservoir to head south from here as part of the State Water Project. But all of that infrastructure is concentrated down in the South Delta. Water flows into the Delta on the main stem of the Sacramento River, the San Joaquin River. There's also the Casumas and Colony Rivers, a number of other tributaries. So there's a lot of water entering the Delta from various points north to south, but all of it currently would be removed through the State Water Project in the south. And so sort of an obvious modification or augmentation to the system would be able to provide some flexibility to the system by adding additional diversion points in the North Delta along the main stem of the Sacramento River, where a lot of that water is entering the Delta in the first place. And so that's the general concept. That's how it was identified by the department in the notice of preparation, just as very broad swaths, broad ideas, broad swaths, consistent with that concept of adding new diversion points in the North Delta that could connect up to that existing State Water Project infrastructure in the South Delta. Then we went through the processes of siting the various facilities, thinking about different ways to configure the project, acknowledging some of the construction challenges and issues, logistical issues that would occur during construction of a massive infrastructure project in this setting, and trying to lay it out in a way that minimizes those effects and allows for the best configuration that we can develop for the project, which is where we are today. We've really been able to think through how to lay out the facilities. We've got the two intakes on the main stem of the Sacramento River, 45 miles of tunnel to connect those intakes down to the existing infrastructure in the south, pumping plant to lift the water out of the tunnel and deliver it directly into Bethany Reservoir. So it's not that complicated of a configuration, but that's taken quite a bit of time to arrive at. Thinking through how best to deliver that project, we would excavate all 45 miles of tunnel from 2 launch locations, which is a real advancement in terms of how to minimize impacts and best construct the project in a way that would minimize those effects. So a lot of thinking has been done up until now, working with DWR, working with stakeholders within the community to lay out that configuration. So we've still got a ways to go, but that I think puts us in the position we're in.
So, but I think, Graham, to the issue about, sort of, as I sort of read it and the different iterations that I've been through, and every time I come to Sacramento, we talk about these kinds of issues. It just strikes me there are some that sort of lock in on, hey, I just, I will never like that thing. And so, you kind of have to know those folks may never be overcome. But then the other pieces of it is, have you found that as information comes forward, as studies like what Dr. Sunding has provided, have you seen people sort of pause, like, oh, okay, well, that's worth considering. Let me hear more about that. Bring me through that process. Does that, kind of help bring people along in the trust factor? Or is this something that, at some certain point, they're just going to have to see how it operates?
Well, I guess I would say it's a little of both, Charlie. I think there are those who really have concerns that live in the vicinity of the project. They will be affected by construction of that project, and they're concerned about how that's going to work out and how the long-term operations are going to potentially affect their lives. I think we really are sensitive to that. We understand the issues and really want to continue to work with those folks in those communities. so that when we do get to the point of implementing the project, that we're working with those groups and doing everything we can to minimize the effects of construction and operations. I think there are others certainly within the water community and within the various communities of the state that are maybe compelled or moved by some of the information that's been shared around the economics of the project. But I think there's also a local issue and a local concern, which I can also understand.
Well, I know we have sort of an adage here with the Southern California Water Coalition that, we educate to advocate, that if people have the information that is available, is good, is credible information, then they'll advocate in their own self-interest, right? And so to the extent that, the interest of a larger state water project you describe, then they'll bring their voice to the table. I also have found, and I will say this about the efforts and the outreach you've done, is the more people who have eyes and participate at the table is appreciated. They may not always agree, but the fact that they're being heard makes a huge difference in sort of how the perception is. And Carrie, is that something that the state very consciously has gone out and looking for, how broad a net can we cast? How do we make sure everybody has a seat at the table? Or do you have kind of a program? It's like, okay, here's where we're going to go, and we just got to drive down that path.
I think that we've really been interested in reaching out to communities and having two-way discussions about the types of effects the project might have and how to avoid them. I think one of the important things to think about is the idea that we understand that the benefits of the project are going to be felt within the state water project areas, which I mentioned earlier, do not include the Delta, but the impacts of construction are going to be in the Delta. And so this is a pretty large construction effort. And we understand that while we work as much as we can to reduce those effects through the conceptual design and through the mitigation included in the EIR, there will be some things that they are left to endure. And that really has been the reason that we've started developing a community benefits program. We've been working to develop that program with the communities. We want to make sure that we're not telling them what they want, that they're telling us what they want. And through that interaction, we've developed a program that includes two key pieces. One of them is a grant fund. So we would be funding community-driven projects that could help the communities. And then the other is what we call implementation commitments. So things like local job targets, training, and what could be things like leave behinds. So for example, if we're building a park and ride and the community would like it to remain when the project is over, we could leave that behind and the community could take that over.
Right. Well, and anytime you're talking about a significant public works type of project, which obviously this is, people start throwing around, dollars and cents. And, when you start getting to the B word, right, at the state, even at the state level, that's a lot of money. And I know for a lot of folks, when you start throwing in costs for a big project, their eyes kind of roll back. It's like, I don't really know what that means. So what does that mean? So Dr. Sunding, I guess when you start talking about then the economic approach that you looked at, there's a lot of dollars in this. How do you sort of work through then that nexus to, if I invest $1 here, I get X back? And how do you make that understandable to somebody on a day-to-day, around the kitchen table, as opposed to, oh, that's government, they just do things with B words and T words, and somehow it's all magic?
Right. That's a great question. So our approach was to, first of all, start with the good information that Graham and others have developed about what actually building and operating the DCP entails from a cost perspective. So we have that all built into the analysis. And by the way, that doesn't include just construction costs and power costs. That includes things like around $1 billion in environmental mitigation, a $200 million community benefit fund for the Delta. So there's a whole range of costs that go into there. But, my perspective about this is that a lot of people have come to the conclusion the status quo in the Delta is unsustainable. One way or another, things are going to change. And one thing that this effort has done is shone a light on how climate impacts might affect things in the Delta, and in particular affect deliveries on the State Water Project. we stand to lose something like a quarter of state water project deliveries just by 2070 as a result of sea level rise. Well, that number, that gets people's attention, and it puts the costs of doing nothing in perspective. If you ask most urban water managers, especially in Southern California, how they would cope with losing a quarter of their state water project supplies, that's a tough question to answer.
Right.
And it would require some pretty dramatic measures and some pretty large shortages, especially in dry periods. So one important thing here is framing. While, yes, there are billions associated with the cost of the DCP, doing nothing, riding into the future with climate change under our existing infrastructure is in fact even more expensive.
Right. Well, and I'm one of those guys like back in the early, Saturday Night Live skits. I was promised there'd be no math, right? I get the big concepts, right? So give me something that I can sort of latch onto. And as I remember, so again, it's sort of the State Water Project, and I kind of go back to that volumetric opportunity to manage. Again, when you looked at the alternatives, even and we're very supportive, right, into things like water recycling, using our water more efficiently, utilizing that as part of that reliability, and I use the term sustainability, because if something is impacted, then you need something else as your belt and suspenders. Dr. Sending, as you just described, if we had not had the last 2 wet years, we were into rationing in Southern California because state water project deliveries weren't there. We were going to experience real hurt, pain, stress because of that, and what that would have meant, not just to lifestyle, but the economy and all of the things that go with that. But then I look at something as big and promising as the big water recycling projects in Los Angeles County that are on the table. And those deliver about 10% of the volume of the state water project. So when I then start racking up in my non-math brain, if it's going to cost me, $6 billion to do this thing, and that's 10%, well, that's easy math for me. If I put, 10 of those on the table, I'm at 60 plus. That starts to make a $20 billion number sound pretty good in terms of cost effectiveness, just, what I'm buying at the store. But then, as you said, there's other things that go into it in terms of productivity, the economy. We love to talk about, we're the 5th largest economy in the world, but without water, that stress would have seen dramatic shifts in employment and people's lifestyles, would it not?
Oh, that's right. And some of the comparisons you were making before, I think, are very appropriate. The incremental amount of water that the DCP saves, so by combating climate impacts, is about 400,000 acre feet per year. So to put that into perspective, the Carlsbad desalination project, which when it was built was the largest desalination project in the Western Hemisphere, it would take 8 of those to achieve the same water supply benefits as the DCP. That we can have a debate about whether or not that's politically or technically feasible, but it's awfully expensive.
Mm-hmm.
As part of our economic assessment of the DCP, we looked at the cost of the water generated by it compared to the cost of desalination, recycling, stormwater capture, water conservation. And what we found is that generally the DCP, while again, it is real money, not trying to minimize that, it's actually substantially cheaper than the cost of many other water supply alternatives that are available.
Right. So, Carrie, you mentioned it a little bit earlier. One of the other advantages here is you're trying to mitigate the risks to the environment. I mean, again, I am a little bit of a history, and I love California history. So if I look at the entirety of the Central Valley up into Sacramento, right, that was all underwater at one point. And with climate change and seawater intrusion and rising, oceans, we're going to see water go back into that area. So it just, again, Captain Obvious, it seemed if you're going to manage a system, you would move yourself out of harm's way as long or as high as possible. But what then are the environmental risks of not doing anything? What is it that happens? I mean, you have all those embedded constituencies and those that don't want to see things change. They like to keep things the way they are because it works for them. But as we all know, nothing's going to remain constant. Everything's going to change in some capacity. So what risks are we then able to help offset by being able to do this new configuration of the project?
So I think one of the concerns we hear a lot is the idea that by adding a North Delta intake that we are essentially abandoning the Delta, that there's this idea that we would be diverting State Water Project water in the North Delta, and we would not be helping maintain water quality or have water flowing through the Delta. And I think that that's a pretty strong misconception in how the project would operate. We would still be using the South Delta facility. This isn't replacing our existing South Delta diversion, it's adding to it. And during most of the time, we would be continuing to operate that South Delta diversion as we do now. So I think I just wanted to highlight the idea that with sea level rise, there is an inherent water quality issue associated with that water moving into the Delta. And by having a sustainable state water project, that really does help manage the water quality in the Delta, both for the State Water Project, but also for the environment and other water users in the Delta.
So, Graham, I sort of led through it with Dr. Sunding in terms of the cost benefit, but okay, you not only have to get to design this thing, but you got to figure out how people are going to pay for it. So I know that's also one of those areas where people sort of say, hey, we don't have the bonding capacity at the state. Hey, the state ought to, the locals ought to. They point the finger at who else should be paying for these things. But how do you have the structure in place for those that to make this kind of project happen and to know that we can do it reasonably over a shorter period of time rather than a long period of time?
Sure. Well, so first of all, as you know, this is a big team of folks working on this program. So the DCA, as I mentioned, is responsible for design and construction of the facilities. We've got the Delta Conveyance Finance Authority, which is another separate body stood up by the public water agencies to support financial decisions and conversations that will ultimately need to be dealt with. Additionally, there's the State Water Contractors, Inc., which is the broader collection of all the public water agencies, whether they're participating in the program or not. They've got a lot of resources and economic contributions into this topic to help sort through. And then, of course, there's DWR and the state. This would ultimately be part of the State Water Project, and the state already has tried and true methods for funding capital projects along the State Water Project. So in essence, this really isn't likely to be dealt with differently than other major infrastructure associated with the State Water Project. This would be funded through revenue bonds, likely issued by the state of California. The public water agencies would be responsible for servicing, paying for that debt through rate collections that they would derive within their service area. So this is not a project that would be funded through sort of a statewide budget. This is funded by the agencies that use the water, would pay for the water, and that's traditionally how funding of the State Water Project has been handled. This probably is a good point maybe to hand it over to Carrie to see if there's anything else that she might want to add or correct in terms of the way I've described it.
No, I think you got it.
Okay.
All right, so then I got to come back to you then. Okay, it's a lot of money. You got a lot of design. You got construction in any project, right? Cost control becomes a fairly significant issue. How do you protect, the cost estimates and making sure that you be able to deliver a project on time and on budget?
This is going to be our priority for the next few years. We issued our updated cost estimate. Prior to that, Dr. Sunding's work was using the old estimate. They were just trying to get things in place and sort of working through all the analysis with some placeholders. We came through this spring after the department selected the Bethany Reservoir alignment and issued an updated cost estimate for that project. At the same time, and just to go ahead and put it out there, that estimate is $20.12 billion. So that's in 2023 real prices. That's the cost that Dr. Sunding's analysis has built in. That's just the construction capital costs. Then, of course, he's got the other costs also accounted for in terms of operations and maintenance, power, et cetera. But in parallel to the development of that estimate, we started thinking about potential innovations. And this is akin to what will eventually be some pretty significant value engineering. And that's a really powerful cost management tool. So we recognize that the design that's evaluated in the EIR is a relatively conservative design. We're working with some assumptions around ground conditions, assumptions around sequencing and timing. All of that will ultimately be analyzed, vetted and analyzed through site-specific data collection, subsurface investigations, testing, and all of that. But we have an amount of data that we can work with, that we worked with through the concept design phase. We also had conservatisms that we needed to assume and apply so that the environmental analysis created an umbrella of impacts. So that leads us to the opportunities that we have with innovation. So we look at those assumptions and start to overlay new information that we've collected, start to overlay potential refinements within the industry, and start, that's been something that we've been focusing on. When we issued the estimate, we also issued what we called a secondary or innovations estimate that captured some credible, reasonable, kind of low-hanging fruit type innovations that designers all felt very strongly about, and we've vetted through our own internal processes with the department to tee up. But these innovations are strictly focused on design and construction innovations. So where we might be able to reduce construction quantities, reduce effort, labor, material requirements. There's 19 of them at this point that we've identified as highly credible. Those 19 innovations are able to reduce the estimate by about $1.25 billion. So 6% of the total project cost we're able to reduce at this point through consideration of innovations. These are not revisions to the project description. These are not revisions to the project overall, but it's helping us focus on the areas of the project where we see the opportunity and where we want to continue to work over the next couple of years. The idea for me is that, right now, this is not the key decision point for the participating public water agencies. That will come in a couple more years. There's still some pretty significant permit activities to get through. We're not ready to implement this project yet, but when we get to that point, I want to make sure that from a cost perspective, we've done everything we can to put forward the best possible project that manages costs, that helps to sort of balance that side of the ledger, to sort of weaken that side of the scale as much as we can, because I know costs are going to increase. I can't stop inflation. There's things that are going to continue to happen, but what we can do is really think about the design side and how we can be smart about those concepts and refine them in reasonable ways so that we tee up the best possible project.
As you're describing that, the analogy, again, I'm Captain Obvious, right? I got to bring this down to a very low level and some of this stuff. It strikes me that as you and as Carrie have described this to me is like, am I going to make significant home improvements to a home I built and I'm already living in, but it's aging and there's modernization, whether it's the electrical system, the plumbing system, et cetera. And I have an opportunity to invest in that new, in my existing property, make that work for the next iteration of my family, as opposed to scrapping the home and then, either moving out of the state or, building something new, something entirely new someplace else. So it becomes really cost prohibitive. Do I have that analogy right? Is that really kind of what we're talking about here, is making home improvements to the state water project and state water delivery system?
Well, I'll just carry your analogy for a second and connect it back to the innovations, and then I'll be quiet on this. But I think you're right. You're dead on. And so the idea would be, when you're sitting down thinking about that home improvement project and saying, all right, what's it going to cost? Maybe you don't know a lot at that point, so you're making a lot of conservative assumptions. All new electrical, all new plumbing, your foundation, everything's got to be new, everything's got to be robust. And that's how you're going to kind of set the umbrella for what you think the project is going to cost and how much effort it's going to take. Then you'd like to spend some time after you've wrapped your head around that, opening things up, looking at the situation with the plumbing, the electrical, kind of refining what you actually need to do to perform that project. But you set yourself kind of a benchmark that's high intentionally, that's an upper threshold, and you want to refine from there. And that's kind of where my head is. We're into that stage where I really want to refine and tee up an accurate project for real consideration. Right now, what we have is constructible, it's conservative.
Right. Carrie, we're not blowing the thing out to the studs. I'm still going to be able to harden it for natural disasters and maybe put some solar panels on my roof, kind of make my home more efficient and give an extended life to something that I already have as a fairly significant investment, which is, again, that's why I use the analogy as an individual. That's the most important investment I'll ever make in my life. And so from a state's perspective, it seems like a natural analogy.
I agree. I think modernizing the State Water Project is really the underlying theme of what we're looking at here. We have this incredibly important resource to California and really the nation and the world when you look at the resources that it supports within the State Water Project service area. And so allowing it to continue to degrade and performance to continue to decline really affects those areas in dramatic ways. Having to replace those supplies with new alternate supplies is more expensive and has its own suite of environmental impacts that we cannot avoid. So agreed, I think modernizing a home is a really good analogy.
Right. So David, I'm going to come back to you as our economist, right? And I'm reminded, see, I'm old enough, I am reminded by the old Eisenhower adage, he was always looking for a one-handed economist because, inevitably he'd ask his economists, okay, on one hand and then on the other. So just give me one hand. I'm not hearing you with an other hand. I'm just saying here pretty straightforward based on your analysis, based on what you've seen, and you have some working history around this type of project. Is it that straightforward, or do we have sort of, horizontal, ifs that if these things happen, then it all makes sense? Or is it a straight line that you've described?
Well, the economic analysis that we've done is predicated on not only Graham's careful engineering estimates, but the best available science on climate impacts. Now, those are forecasts, and no one knows exactly how things are going to evolve. But we proceed from the assumption that climate change is real, it's upon us. The sea level is rising, and that has dramatic impacts on how the Delta is operated for water supply purposes. So again, this project has a real focus on climate mitigation. And, I'll chime in also and say your analogy about shoring up a house or reinforcing against earthquakes or other risks, it's a very good analogy to what this is about. Rather than just leaving that house the way it is and investing in a new one, what our study concludes is that it's cheaper to adapt the existing house, make it shipshape and state of the art and able to withstand earthquakes and climate change. That's actually a much cheaper way to go. What our study shows overall is that the benefits are over 2 times greater than the costs. So there's a safety margin in there. If things don't turn out exactly the way we think, either on the benefit side or the cost side, there's still a very high likelihood that we'll look back a few decades in the future and say, gosh, that was a great investment. So to the extent that we're able to forecast the future, this sure looks like a good project from my point of view.
Good. Well, the other thing, Carrie, I'm going to come back to you because this is kind of the political question, right? As I stated earlier, one of the good things about the state of California is we're really big and we're really diverse. And this serves the overwhelming majority of the state's population and its economy. So you get all of that big and diverse and trying to bring all those people to the table. That's one of those big sort of unknowns politically. Is the outreach, is the education, is that, you think, going to bring people politically and keep them sort of, hey, even if they don't like it, it's like, I get it, right? That we got to move this thing forward. Is that a risk that's just one of those wildly unknown that somehow somebody takes some weird political turn and kind of sail off into a different direction and then kind of leave us all sort of standing here wondering what happened?
I think that we really do understand the real concerns from the Delta residents, people who are near these facilities, people who will endure this construction project. And in no way do I want to minimize those concerns. We really try to listen and do what we can to help, but they are real issues. But I think that we don't want to forget that is one part of the state and that there is a lot of the state that needs this project and understands the need for this project. The governor is a really, really vocal supporter of this project. He is very committed to getting the permitting done. This is a commitment I feel very strongly. And I think that I really want to emphasize that he sees the need for this. He sees the problems that if the project does not get built, what happens to a really large swath of California and the need for that reliable water supply. So I think that set of politics is complicated, but important.
Yeah. Well, I can say this, right? Just anecdotally, my experience, regardless of who the governor has been over the last several iterations, Democrat and Republican, conservative, liberal, whatever tag you want to put on them, all of them have come to the same conclusion that we have to be able to find a way to fix, to modernize this system. That was in the best interest of the entirety of the state, that nobody was trying to force anything on anybody, but it was about, okay, how do we make this happen with the least possible impact, but get the maximum value and benefit out of it for the greatest number of the state of California. So, I mean, they maybe throw rocks at me for that, but that's kind of my learning of the project. So it makes it easier, I think, probably for us to talk about these things in a slightly different context. I get the other side. I get sort of as people want to have their issues considered. I also have, that 30 plus years of history with the state of California, that if you need improvements, you need new revenue, you need a new project, you need to inject capital in some way. And the way that this has been designed seems to satisfy all of those needs. Well, all right, I love to end this way. So you get the last question. It's like, because I get to put you in charge. So Carrie, you now are completely and totally in charge, and you live this day to day. What is it that you see as the greatest risk and the greatest opportunity to try to bring these constituencies together and to finalize something that works for the state?
I think that talking about bringing the constituencies together is something that I'm hesitant to do. I think that we really try to recognize that those opinions are real and important, and we're not trying to change their hearts and minds, but understand them. Mm-hmm. So I guess I want to be careful about my goal in terms of opportunities, that we're not really trying to change minds, but provide opportunities that we will have a project that is built in a way that it has the least effects as possible to those local communities. I think that's really important, that we are keeping that in mind. I think successful implementation of the community benefits program is key. I think that we really have a firm recognition that this is important and it matters. It is part of the project. It is part of our implementation. And I think that coupling that with having a project that is implementable and constructible and feasible, as Graham is working on, is really the key part to having this all move forward.
So Graham, you're designing, you're constructing, okay, you're in charge, you got the world by the tail now. What is it you see as the greatest opportunity, greatest risk for the DCA?
It's not a small project. I think I should say probably the biggest challenge and opportunity here is information and how we share it. The biggest challenge is if we're surprising the world with big changes over time. I really want to minimize surprises for all involved. I think the price tag is out there. That, of course, is going to continue to evolve. We're very transparent about that. I think we've been trying to be very clear about the potential construction impacts associated with the project. This is not a situation where it does anyone any good to sort of put things under the rug and not talk about it. We're trying to deal with everything up front, because I feel like that's the only way we're going to be successful here. And thinking through as much as we can all the small details, of which there are many, many small details, but thinking those through, making sure we have a plan, incorporating them into the designs, incorporating them into the schedule, making sure they're reasonably reflected in the cost. Acknowledging risk is a significant concept at this point, and accounting for risk in terms of the estimate, in terms of how we develop the schedules. All of that to me is just about confronting the topic of information in a really a really transparent way. We're happy to share as much information as anybody wants to know about the project. And I think that's really our primary objective, is to just minimize surprises and make sure that everyone has access to any information that they might want on this project. All
right, Dr. Sunday, you get the final word, right? They have put you now in complete charge there on campus. You're so tell us, how do we actually do all of these things, right? And I'm just reminded, right, again, it's California does big, audacious, terrific, wonderful things, right? This to me sounds like one of those kind of historic California opportunities to really lead not just the nation, but the world in how we do water management. If you're in charge for the day, what's the best thing we can do? What's the biggest opportunity here that we need to make sure we keep in mind?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. A climate mitigation project of this scale, it's not quite unique in the world, but you're right, it's notable. The idea of spending tens of billions of dollars to actually address foreseeable impacts of climate change. It's not just the water sector that's going to have to be looking at things this way. There's a number of other parts of our infrastructure that are going to have to get reinforced. So that's a good perspective to have. Our study, the economic study, is intended to be a careful analysis of benefits and costs, but it's a piece that sort of shows how the DCP could impact water management across the state. Now, each individual agency, urban and agricultural, is going to have to take our information from Graham's shop, other sources of information, put it all together, look at it through their own lens, make sure that it makes sense for their ratepayers. And that's very much the process that we're engaged in right now. Me and my team have looked at this from a statewide perspective. Now, the discussion goes kind of at a more granular level, and agencies take a look and come to their own conclusions. So that's very much the effort that we're engaged in now.
Well, Carrie, Graham, Dr. Sunding, I want to thank you all for helping us in understanding sort of what the current design and construction looks like, the cost, the financial opportunities, and the risks that go with this. I know from our perspective at the Southern California Water Coalition, again, as I said, we educate to advocate. So allowing us to help bring this and to raise questions, help answer questions for people, that's what we're designed to do. That's what we hope to be able to do. I want to thank all of you for being with us today on What Matters Water, TV, and Podcast, for helping illuminate and try to bring the conversation forward so that we have an opportunity to help move this along. So thank you all for being with us on What Matters Water and TV Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Well, thanks for joining us on What Matters Water, TV, and Podcast. If you like today's discussion, go to wherever you download your podcasts and give us that 5-star rating. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. That'll help us build our presence in this new world and on this format. And if you're interested, as always, in helping sponsor this program, please reach out to us at socalwater.org and send us a message. Now, as we close today's show, I leave you with this challenge. Be a part of the conversation. Be a part of the solution. At the Southern California Water Coalition, we educate to advocate. So as public policy leaders have difficult choices, together we help them make informed decisions. Thanks for being with us. We will see you again next time on What Matters Water, TV, and Podcast.